Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something really fundamental to who we are.
Yeah, something really core.
Exactly. How those very first relationships in our lives, the difficult or even damaging ones, how they can stick with us, shaping our brains and our well-being profoundly.
Mm.
You've shared some fascinating stuff on this, and, well, our goal today is to really get to the heart of it. What does it all mean for understanding ourselves and others, too?
Absolutely. And we've got a couple of key resources we're drawing on. One gives us a pretty accessible look at relational trauma, especially thinking about codependency and these things called trauma bonds.
Right, trauma bonds, we hear that term a lot.
We do. And the other source is, well, it's a detailed academic article by Alan Shore. It's called The Effects of Early Relational Trauma on Right Brain Development, Affect Regulation, and Infant Mental Health.
Okay, so that one sounds like it goes deep into the science.
It really does. It dives right into the neurobiology, like how these early experiences actually impact the physical development of the brain.
So our mission today, then, is to go beyond just, defining relational trauma.
Yeah.
We want to understand the deeper stuff, the psychological mechanisms going on.
Exactly. Give you insights that are powerful, hopefully relevant for navigating your own experiences, or just understanding human connections better.
Yeah, without getting totally bogged down in, super technical jargon.
Right. We'll try to keep it clear.
Okay, so let's start, at the beginning. When we talk about relational trauma in those early years, what does that actually look like? What are we talking about?
Well, at its core, early relational trauma can lead to developing these unhealthy emotional attachments. They make it really hard to have a healthy sense of yourself separate from the other person.
Like you can't stand on your own 2 feet emotionally.
Sort of. One of the sources even describes how a partner in that kind of dynamic can feel almost like a drug.
A drug. Wow.
Yeah, like the only thing that matters. And there's this tendency to just push down your own needs, your own feelings, because you're terrified of losing that person. You see them as your only source of, everything. Happiness, security, maybe even love.
Gosh, that sounds incredibly isolating, like you're completely dependent.
It is, exactly. The thought of leaving, even just for a short time, it can feel completely impossible, brings up intense anxiety. Another pattern you often see is one person taking total responsibility for the other person's happiness, always trying to meet these excessive demands, maybe needing constant contact, constant reassurance.
Right, that need for constant validation.
Yeah, and that kind of dynamic, it can get very damaging very quickly. Saving the other person, rationalizing when boundaries are broken, this constant push and pull, control, maybe lies, building illusions.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. And this cycle, it can absolutely lead to one or both partners developing trauma.
And all that energy just poured into keeping this fragile thing going.
Yeah.
It must just, take a huge toll, right, on your health.
Oh, absolutely. The material we looked at talks about how this can cause really significant problems. Mental health, obviously, but physical health, too. It can damage your other relationships, even mess with your finances. And biologically, you can actually see it. Big swings in cortisol levels, that's your main stress hormone.
Right.
An increased risk for things like addiction. Your immune system can get weaker. Self-esteem becomes really unstable, shaky.
And you mentioned this can even cross generations.
Yeah, potentially, it's suggested. And then there's the immediate suffering during crises in these relationships, which is, severe. But long-term, people might end up feeling overly dependent, or actually the opposite, totally isolated, scared to get close to anyone again.
That paints a really, really tough picture.
Yeah.
And then there's this specific idea. You mentioned the trauma bond. How's that different from just, say, a generally unhealthy relationship?
Well, a trauma bond often has this specific kind of imbalance. Like, one person tends to shy away from real emotional closeness, real intimacy, while the other person is constantly chasing it, desperate for any little crumb of affection or connection.
Ah, the pursuer and the distancer dynamic.
Kind of, yeah. Communication's usually terrible. Big differences in what each person needs, what they want, what they expect. One might still be clinging to hope, thinking it can work, while the other has, frankly, already checked out emotionally.
But they can't leave.
Exactly. Despite all this dysfunction, they feel trapped, utterly unable to separate.
So it's like being stuck on this painful loop, longing and disappointment.
Precisely. And there's often a lot of blame flying around. People get stuck in these roles, the persecutor, the victim, the rescuer, that whole drama triangle.
Right.
And when the relationship finally does end, people often describe it like a detox, like coming off a drug.
A detox. Wow.
Yeah, really difficult withdrawal feelings, Emptiness, helplessness, loads of anxiety, maybe obsessive thoughts about the person.
That sounds brutal.
It is. And one of the really key insights here, I think, is that with relational trauma, the original source of the pain is kind of internal. It messes with how you see yourself, your relationship with yourself.
Okay.
But, and this is the tricky part, healing also happens through connection. Reconnecting with yourself, yes, but also finding healthy connections with other people.
That's a really crucial point.
Yeah,
Even though the wound starts inside, reaching out is still vital for getting better.
absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about these relationship patterns, but what's actually happening inside the brain because of these difficult early experiences? This is where Alan Shore's research that focus on the right side of the brain
Right.
comes in, right? That's so important here.
Yes, exactly. Shore's work is critical here. He highlights how a brain that's experienced early relational trauma can actually, misinterpret things, even neutral interactions.
Misinterpret, how so?
Well, for example, someone setting a perfectly healthy boundary might be felt as an attack, as aggression.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And there's also a greater chance of dissociation. That's a way of kind of mentally disconnecting from feelings that are just too overwhelming.
Right, like zoning out.
Kind of, yeah. And that dissociation can then lead to more misunderstandings of social cues. It can create this really deep lack of self-trust, constant overthinking, comparing yourself to others, feeling excessive guilt for no real reason.
So it's like your internal alarm system is just permanently dialed up to 11, always scanning for danger, even when it's not there.
That's a great way to put it. Exactly. Your sense of self-worth often gets completely tangled up with external things,
Like what?
like achievements or how you look or whether you're in a relationship or not. You might really struggle with basic questions like, who am I, really?
Mm-hmm.
And to feel even remotely stable, you might need constant reassurance, constant proof of loyalty from other people.
That sounds exhausting for everyone involved.
It is. You become hypervigilant, seeing threats everywhere, even in a compliment, maybe. You get overly suspicious and incredibly self-critical, really harsh on yourself, and find it almost impossible to handle even mild negative feedback.
Gosh, that sounds incredibly stressful just to live with day to day.
It really is. And the sources also talk about how, by kind of shutting down feelings, people might end up enduring really difficult, even unbearable treatment in relationships.
Because they've cut off from feeling the pain?
Exactly. They might try to cope with this constantly overwhelmed nervous system through, well, substance use maybe, or other compulsive behaviors, anything to numb out or distract.
Right.
Interestingly, some might go the other way. Extreme self-denial, like rejecting basic bodily needs, maybe seeing it as a kind of strict discipline or asceticism.
Wow. Extremes.
Yeah. And ultimately, people might start to believe there's something fundamentally broken or wrong with them. You might see thoughts of self-harm, real problems with the nervous system, like dysregulation, trouble concentrating, memory issues, intense rage or hatred bubbling up.
That's a heavy list.
It is. And sadly, there's also this tendency to unconsciously repeat these patterns, choosing partners who have similar difficult backgrounds, which just continues the cycle of trauma.
It makes sense in a painful way.
Hmm.
You gravitate towards what feels familiar, even if it's damaging.
Unfortunately, yes.
And Shore's work, it really gets into the neurobiology of this, doesn't it? How those early attachments literally sculpt the developing brain. What are some of the main takeaways you found?
Yeah, Shore's central point is that those early attachment experiences and how they shape our ability to regulate our emotions are just absolutely critical for healthy development, period.
Okay.
When an infant has a secure attachment, with a caregiver who's emotionally tuned in, responsive, it directly supports the healthy growth of the right side of the brain.
Or right side specifically.
Yes, he really focuses on the right hemisphere's role in socio-emotional processing, and this secure base helps the baby learn how to manage their emotions, effectively what scientists call affect regulation.
Affect regulation.
Yeah. And that promotes good infant mental health overall.
So a secure, loving early connection is like literally building a strong foundation for the brain.
That's a perfect analogy, precisely. On the flip side, early relational trauma disrupts the development of the brain's stress coping systems,
Okay.
which can then lead to mental health challenges down the road. Shore specifically talks about something called disorganized or disoriented attachment, type D, he calls it.
Type D.
Yeah. It's more common in infants who've experienced abuse or neglect, and this pattern is strongly linked to difficulties handling stress and a tendency towards dissociation later in life.
And that caregiver's role,
Yeah.
It sounds like it's absolutely pivotal in those first couple of years, shaping that foundation.
Oh, absolutely. Crucial. Shore describes the primary caregiver as essentially being an external psychobiological regulator for the infant's nervous system.
An external regulator.
Yeah. During those first 2 years, which is a period of incredibly rapid, experience-dependent brain growth, those early social interactions, they get sort of imprinted onto the brain structures maturing at that time.
It printed. Wow.
It has long-lasting effects. And he emphasizes it's not just, big traumatic events necessarily. Repeated emotional abuse, that chronic misattunement, is central to childhood trauma and really negatively impacts cognitive development.
So it's the ongoing emotional climate, not just isolated incidents, that really molds the brain.
Exactly. Relational trauma is often cumulative, something that happens over and over, and it has both immediate effects and these long-term consequences, significantly upping the risk for later psychiatric disorders.
Right.
Even things happening during pregnancy, like the mother's stress levels, can negatively impact fetal brain development and the baby's stress response systems before they're even born.
That's incredible.
Shore explains that caregivers who are abusive or severely neglectful, they often put infants into these traumatic states of intense negative emotion, fear, distress. They offer little comfort or protection, they're emotionally inaccessible, and they react in ways that are inappropriate or frightening to the infant's own feelings and needs.
So the baby is left feeling overwhelmed and unsafe.
Exactly. It leads to the infant being either extremely overstimulated or sometimes understimulated and neglected. And these prolonged negative emotional states, they actually change the brain's chemistry and severely impair the baby's ability to develop healthy ways of coping.
So the infant's brain is basically being flooded with stress chemicals during these difficult interactions without the soothing counterbalance.
That's a very accurate way to think about it, yes. And this trauma can actually alter how the brain processes social information, particularly affecting the development of that right brain, which, as we said, is specialized for handling socio-emotional information. In these traumatic situations, caregivers often fail to do what Shore calls repair, those moments of coming back together after a disconnect. Without that repair, infants are left stuck in these highly disruptive psychobiological states that are way beyond their ability to manage alone.
And the long-term effects of never getting that emotional repair, that coming back together, they must be significant.
They really can be. Shore points to a lasting deficit, a difficulty in assimilating new emotional experiences later in life. This hinders the development of a coherent, integrated personality. He also talks about how trauma can lead to mutually escalating over-arousal between the caregiver and infant.
What does that mean?
It's like this dysregulated emotional feedback loop. They wind each other up, getting more and more distressed, which further stresses the baby's developing system.
Wow. Okay. And dissociation, that mental checking out we mentioned.
Yeah.
That often comes in as a way to cope.
Yes, it often emerges later as a reaction to this overwhelming early stress. Disengaging from what's happening outside, emotional numbing, avoidance, maybe just being overly compliant, having a restricted affect, that sort of glazed look.
Like the brain's emergency brake, hitting the off switch when things are just too much.
Exactly. A survival mechanism. But these early traumatic states cause psychobiological alterations, changes affecting affect, cognition, behavior. They negatively impact the developing limbic system, the brain's emotional hub.
Right, the limbic system.
And they induce these maladaptive coping styles for regulating stress. Frequent intense attachment disruptions expose the infant brain to high levels of potentially neurotoxic substances like glutamate and cortisol.
Enough stress hormones again.
Yeah. And this can potentially lead to neuronal cell death, actual damage to brain cells, and impaired limbic morphogenesis. That's the shaping and development of the limbic structure.
So actual structural changes in the brain.
Potentially, yes. Severe attachment disruption leads to regulatory failure, disturbances in limbic activity, hypothalamic dysfunction, problems with autonomic homeostasis, keeping the body's systems balanced, and just chaotic biochemical alterations. Trauma can cause permanent alterations in various neurochemical receptor systems in the brain.
It really sounds like early relational trauma can leave a deep, lasting physical imprint on the brain's hardware, not just the software.
It absolutely can. Shore also goes into more detail about that type D or disorganized attachment pattern. He explains these infants often show high heart rate activation, really intense alarm reactions in stressful situations.
Hyper-alertness.
Yes, and higher cortisol levels too. This indicates a really low tolerance for stress and an inability to form coherent coping strategies when they're alarmed by the very person who's supposed to be their safe base, the parent.
That's the awful paradox, isn't it? The source of safety is also the source of fear.
Precisely. And interestingly, he notes that the behaviors seen in type D attachment can sometimes resemble those of neurologically impaired infants.
Huh.
Yeah, reflecting a severely impaired regulatory system, particularly involving the orbitofrontal control system, that key area in the front of the brain for managing emotions and social behavior.
And you mentioned earlier the connection with the mother's state,
Yeah.
how the baby almost mirrors it.
Absolutely. Infants can literally match the rhythmic structures of a dysregulated mother's internal states. It's like they're downloading patterns of psychopathology, as Shore puts it.
Downloading, that's a powerful image.
It is. And mothers of disorganized infants often report their own significant struggles, feeling unable to care for their babies, using harsh punishments, dealing with depression, feeling out of control. And very often this stems from their own unresolved trauma and loss.
Which highlights that intergenerational transmission you mentioned.
Exactly. How trauma can sadly ripple down through families. Shore also talks about caregiver dissociation when the parent checks out emotionally as representing real-time and neglect. This leads the infant to shift from protest crying, trying to get attention, to detachment and eventually dissociation themselves, matching the mother's state. It's a profound regulatory failure, a kind of break or discontinuity in the infant's experience of being.
Just devastating.
It is. Trauma interferes with psychic structure formation, the building of a coherent self, by causing these profound neurobiological alterations in the developing limbic system. You get both sympathetic hyperexcitation, that fight or flight overdrive, and parasympathetic hyperinhibition, that freeze or shut down response.
So the nervous system is just completely out of whack.
Essentially, yes. And dissociation becomes a primary defense mechanism because the child hasn't developed that basic sense of worthiness or learned normal adaptive defenses. Early trauma increases the likelihood of relying on it.
Right.
Furthermore, it disrupts the organization of those critical cortical limbic areas involved in attachment, empathy, affect regulation, all functions mediated by these frontal limbic areas. Stress itself can alter prefrontal cortex development, potentially even arresting it, slowing it down. Trauma during critical developmental windows for structures like the amygdala, the anterior cingulate, the insula, all key emotional processing centers, can interfere with their maturation. This impacts social bonds, emotional arousal, the very experience of basic emotion.
It affects so many fundamental aspects of being human.
It really does. Abuse and neglect specifically hit that orbital prefrontal limbic system hard, the system crucial for social bonding and emotional knowledge.
So it's clear relational trauma can alter brain development even without physical injury.
That's a crucial point. And Shore also notes the reverse is true. Neurological trauma can negatively impact relational development. It's a two-way street.
Okay.
Interestingly, both physical stressors and psychosocial stressors, like abuse or neglect, can lead to similar patterns of impaired energy metabolism in the developing brain. Early relational trauma can act as an inducer of developmental instability.
Instability, meaning?
Meaning it can potentially contribute to alterations in how the brain hemispheres specialize cerebral lateralization and increase vulnerability to various neurodevelopmental disorders.
Fascinating.
He suggests there might be excessive pruning, like an over-trimming of connections in those crucial subcortical limbic autonomic circuits in early trauma. This could be a mechanism leading to structural defects in stress coping systems.
So the brain might be trimming away connections it actually needs.
Potentially, yes, as a maladaptive response to overwhelming stress. Animal studies, like maternal deprivation studies in infant mammals, have actually shown stress can induce cell death.
Actual cell death.
Yes, and stress-induced shrinkage of dendritic fields. The branches that receive signals on neurons in the orbitofrontal cortex can reduce synaptic connectivity and the flow of information in those vital regulatory circuits.
So less communication within the brain's control centers.
Right. An impairment of the forebrain midbrain circuit can limit the capacity to inhibit those hyperaroused states, intense fear, rage. Severe attachment issues often involve impairments in both circuits of the dual circuit limbic system, limiting the ability to modulate both intense positive and negative effects.
So difficulty managing strong emotions across the board.
Exactly. And this early dysfunction of internal coping mechanisms tends to endure, leading to inefficient stress regulation in adulthood. Orbitofrontal dysfunction due to early trauma can predispose individuals to developing post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD.
Ah, the PTSD link.
Yes, loss of affect regulation is seen as a core, far-reaching effect of early trauma involving this impaired orbitofrontal system. PTSD research consistently shows dysfunctional frontal subcortical systems and altered function in the orbitofrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, and amygdala.
All those areas we've been talking about.
Right, that severe pruning of connections between higher and lower limbic circuits could manifest as the functional deficits you see in PTSD.
And those connections between the frontal areas and the amygdala, the brain's fear center, you said that those are particularly vulnerable.
Yes, those connections form postnatally, after birth, and seem especially negatively impacted by relational trauma. Reduced inhibition from the orbitofrontal areas allows those amygdala-driven fear responses to fire off without sufficient cortical control.
Like the brakes aren't working properly.
Exactly. An inefficient orbitofrontal repair capacity leads to poor self-comforting during stress. Distress states get easily amplified, and people can cycle between intrusive flashbacks and dissociation.
That makes sense.
fMRI research points to the right orbitofrontal cortex's inability to modulate the amygdala fear response as underlying the emotional disturbances in PTSD, and dysregulation of the sympathetic nervous system control center in the hypothalamus due to impaired orbitofrontal inhibition might mediate relationally triggered uncontrolled aggression.
So it can manifest as fear and aggression.
Potentially, yes. Disrupted early attachments are also extremely common in borderline personality disorder, which has a high correlation with PTSD and shares disturbances in affect regulation, impulse control, and dissociation.
Right. The overlap is significant.
Shore suggests that inefficient higher cortical regulation of the immobility response dissociation and potentially even predatory attack behaviors can result from excessive pruning of prefrontal connections due to early trauma. He even posits that sociopathic personality organization could be seen as a manifestation of developmental PTSD.
That's a strong statement.
It is. Severe attachment psychopathologies often rely heavily on dissociation as a primary defense, indicating orbitofrontal cortex dysfunction in integrating external and internal information.
So dissociation isn't just psychological. It has this clear neurological basis rooted in early trauma.
That's the argument, yes. An immature orbitofrontal system under stress can lead to this coupled, non-reciprocal mode of autonomic control, hyperexcitation, and hyperinhibition happening simultaneously, resulting in the freeze response.
The deer in headlights feeling.
Exactly. Severe attachment pathologies show inefficient orbitofrontal capacity in coordinating the two branches of the autonomic nervous system, ANS, leading to difficulties regulating shifts between different affective states. A habitual tendency to shift into those primitive parasympathetic states, like dissociation, indicates an immature regulatory system with weak connections between the limbic system and the ANS, particularly involving the slower maturing orbitofrontal areas that regulate the parasympathetic system.
Okay.
Massive inhibition of the dorsal motor vagal system, a primitive part of the parasympathetic system, is thought to mediate dissociation as a trauma defense. Dissociation is a symptom across a spectrum of severe psychopathologies and is proposed to be linked to disorganized attachment.
Yeah.
In traumatic abuse, dissociation can involve cutting off from both external stimuli and internal bodily sensations like pain.
Numbing out physically, too.
Yes. The freeze response and cataleptic immobility in trauma involve a switch to parasympathetic hyperarousal, potentially mediated by the body's own endogenous opioids.
It's both fascinating and, frankly, a bit unsettling to see how deep these trauma responses are neurologically.
It really is. Early trauma can even alter the organization of brain circuits that process pain. Persistent neonatal pain experiences can actually rewire these circuits, leading to lasting changes in pain response.
So early pain changes how you feel pain later.
It seems so. And relational trauma-associated pain can have more severe consequences than non-traumatic pain, involving intense emotional and autonomic responses and activation of the limbic system. The orbitofrontal areas are involved in both the perception and regulation of pain, especially its effective motivational aspects, the emotional side of pain. This is crucial for coping with threat-related pain and relational abuse.
Okay.
A mature orbitofrontal system can regulate both sympathetic and corticosteroid levels and modulate amygdala defense reactions. But stress can take these prefrontal areas offline in compromised systems.
Right, the system gets overwhelmed.
Exactly. And dissociation at the time of trauma is known to be a strong predictor of later developing PTSD. Characterological dissociation, where it becomes a habitual coping style, can be used to defend against a broad range of daily stressors, undermining the continuity of experience. These patterns often originate in infant relational trauma.
It disrupts your sense of self over time.
Yes. Dissociation involves a disruption of consciousness's monitoring and controlling functions. Shore suggests this might stem from defensively disregarding a caregiver's harmful intentions, which then impacts later intimate relationships and the ability to process abusive experiences. Impaired orbitofrontal activity is linked to difficulties in behavior control, monitoring experiences, allocating attention, and choosing appropriate actions in stressful situations.
So it creates this fundamental break in developing a solid sense of self, feeling safe.
That's a key insight. Early trauma can hinder the development of what Winnicott called a continuity in being. You end up with a personality built more on reactions to environmental impingement rather than a cohesive, spontaneous self. Dissociation can be a defense against the psychological catastrophe, as Shore terms it.
Wow.
But the maladaptive aspect of dissociation is the difficulty exiting the state. It leads to prolonged shutdown, impermeability to attachment, and interactive regulation, which hinders emotional learning and right brain development.
So it protects you in the moment, but hinders growth long term.
Exactly. Severe regulatory disorders, Shore argues, have a developmental right brain etiology. The coping deficits in type D infants, right lateralized structural defects seen in some studies, and neuroscience findings on adult brains all point towards how early relational trauma alters right brain maturation and increases psychopathology risk.
Right.
We mentioned those daze or trance-like expressions in type D infants. Freezing behavior in primates is linked to high cortisol and right frontal EEG activity. And EEG studies show right frontal asymmetry in infants of depressed mothers, who may be neglectful, which is linked to emotional reactivity and vulnerability to psychopathology. The right amygdala is involved in storing fearful faces. The right orbitofrontal cortex shows enhanced response to anger expressions.
So that right side is really tuned into threat cues.
It seems so. And non-consciously processed stressors like threatening faces or sounds you're not even aware you perceived can trigger dysregulation and dissociation in early traumatized individuals. Disorganized, disoriented children can show dissociative responses just looking at family photographs.
Just photo.
Yeah. Unconscious working models of disorganized attachment encode these enduring negative schemas of self and interaction with misattuning others. These get accessed under stress and are stored primarily in the right hemisphere, which is dominant for unconscious processes and episodic autobiographical memory.
So these patterns operate below awareness.
Often, yes. Early abusive memories, stored in the right hemisphere outside conscious awareness, can exist as imagistic traumatic memories with associated survival behaviors, completely unknown to the left hemisphere because of the separate memory systems.
Wow. Like split parts of the self.
In a way, a limited representational capacity can also result from early relational trauma occurring before adequate self-other differentiation and symbolic capacity have developed.
So trouble putting experiences into words or understanding them conceptually.
Exactly. Relational trauma in the second year, Shore suggests, can lead to severe pruning of right orbitofrontal callosal axons, the connections linking the hemispheres. This hinders the left hemisphere's ability to semantically process the effective information coming from the right hemisphere.
Which means?
Difficulty talking about emotions. Alexithymia.
Alexithymia, difficulty identifying and describing feelings.
Right. It's linked to right hemisphere deficits and developmental trauma. It can manifest in emotional outbursts, blocking feelings, impaired nonverbal expression. Right hemisphere involvement is also reported in somatization physical symptoms without a medical cause and hysterical paresthesia.
Okay.
But importantly, the right hemisphere continues to reorganize throughout life, and the orbitofrontal regions remain plastic adaptable, so there's potential for ongoing development.
That's the hopeful part.
It is. However, early exposure to dysregulation can certainly hinder their initial organization. Maladaptive infant mental health can lead to a static, closed system unable to learn from the new socio-emotional experiences needed for continued right brain growth.
This paints a really intricate picture, but ultimately, yeah, hopeful. It suggests while early experiences have these profound effects, there is potential for change. And this brings us to, well, what can we do? Implications for early intervention.
Right. What does this neurobiological understanding tell us about helping? First, Shore cautions we can't automatically infer relational trauma just from developmental deflections. Neurological impairments can sometimes cause similar issues.
Okay, important distinction.
But a sensitive primary caregiver can significantly enhance the developmental trajectory, even if there are constitutional deficits. Also, orbitofrontal deficiencies aren't exclusive to relational trauma. They're seen in various neurological and psychiatric conditions.
Right.
Abnormalities in limbic system connectivity play a critical role in psychopathology, with the specific affected circuit determining how the affect dysregulation expresses itself.
Got it.
It's also crucial to remember that the process of prefrontal subcortical parcellation, the fine-tuning of these connections, continues right into adolescence.
Into the teen years.
Yes, which means early deficits can sometimes be exacerbated, potentially leading to late-appearing psychopathologies whose roots, Shore argues, can often be traced back to early attachment disturbances.
So early identification and support are absolutely crucial, even if the full impact isn't clear right away.
Absolutely. Promoting affect regulation is a common mechanism, a core goal in psychotherapy. The consensus now is that therapeutic interventions for severe attachment disorders should begin as early as possible.
Makes sense.
Emotionally available therapists can help young children develop self-regulation capacities. That interactive regulation within therapy can function as a growth-facilitating environment for those right orbitofrontal systems.
Like providing the regulatory experience the child missed out on earlier.
Exactly. Potentially shifting attachment patterns towards security. fMRI evidence actually suggests the higher right prefrontal cortex plays a role in attenuating emotional responses, calming things down, which is a key aspect of how psychotherapy works.
Interesting.
And co-constructing a coherent trauma narrative, putting the story together in a safe relational context that can promote callosal transfer, getting information across between the hemispheres. It allows the left hemisphere to process, make sense of, the right hemisphere's emotional states.
Integrating the experience.
Yes. So early prevention programs are just crucial. This all aligns with psychoneurobiological models, emphasizing the impact of early environmental interactions on brain behavior development and the whole concept of critical periods.
Right, those windows of opportunity.
The right hemisphere's rapid growth spurt early in life and its experience-dependent maturation within the attachment relationship just highlights how incredibly important those early relational experiences are, and the skills clinicians use to foster a safe therapeutic environment. Those can also be really valuable in preventative programs, helping mobilize an individual's own positive developmental potential.
This has been, wow, a deeply insightful and, yeah, sometimes challenging exploration to try and bring it all together. We've seen how those very early relational experiences, especially when they're difficult, traumatic, they can have a really profound, lasting impact.
Deep impact.
Affecting not just our emotional well-being,
Yeah.
how we do relationships, but the actual structure and function of our developing brains, especially that right hemisphere, as you've laid out.
Yeah.
We've touched on the complexities of trauma bonds, the long-term biological effects of stress, and just how critical secure early attachments are for building resilience later on.
Yes, understanding that these early interactions literally shape the brain, it just underscores the fundamental importance of nurturing supportive caregiving right from the start.
Absolutely. And considering this profound, enduring impact, here's something for you, the listener, to really think about. With this deeper understanding of relational trauma, the vital role of supportive caregiving, how might our society shift? Approaches to education, healthcare, even just our everyday interpersonal relationships.
Big question.
Could this knowledge ultimately foster healthier development, greater well-being for everyone across the whole lifespan? It's definitely a powerful concept to consider. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.